In the final months of World War II, the world lost forever the voice of a young girl who, through her diary, left testimony of one of humanity's darkest chapters. Anne Frank, hidden with her family in the back of a building in Amsterdam, lived for more than 2 years under the weight of fear until on August 4, 1944, a Nazi raid ended her fragile refuge. Although it is still uncertain who betrayed them, Dutch police officers under the orders of SS officer Karl Silberbauer stormed the hiding place and arrested its occupants. The place was looted, but thanks to the bravery of 2 helpers, Anne's diary was saved from oblivion. What followed was a journey marked by despair and loss. After being arrested, the Franks were sent to Westerbork and weeks later deported to Auschwitz on an overcrowded train where the prisoner's humanity was reduced to the bare minimum. Anne, her mother and her sister were separated from her father and eventually transferred to the Bergen-Belsen camp where hunger, cold and disease reigned. There, among feverish bodies and dimmed eyes, Anne fell ill with typhus alongside her sister Margot. Both died shortly before the camp was liberated. From a normal childhood to the beginning of the flight, Anne Frank. Before the hiding, Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929, in the German city of Frankfurt am Main. Her family belonged to the city's liberal Jewish community. Her father, Otto Frank, was an educated man with a background in business, and he ran a company together with his brother. Her mother, Edith, was a homemaker who cared for their 2 daughters, Margot, the elder, and Anne, the younger. In the early years, the family lived peacefully. They had friends, attended social gatherings, and the girls grew up in a loving environment. Anne was a healthy, energetic, and curious child. Margot, more serious and quiet, already stood out for her academic excellence. The Franks lived in a mixed neighborhood where Jews and non-Jews coexisted. But in 1933, when Hitler came to power, everything changed abruptly. Anti-Jewish laws began to be enforced without delay. Otto Frank realized that his family would no longer be safe in Germany. Jews were excluded from business, education, and public life. Signs of discrimination appeared everywhere. Otto traveled to Amsterdam in search of a solution. He knew some people there and saw a chance to start anew. He found a job as a representative for Opekta, a company that sold products for making jams. In September 1933, he moved alone to the Netherlands. Shortly after, Edith and Margot followed him, while Anne stayed temporarily with her grandparents. When Otto had secured housing and work, the family reunited. Anne arrived in Amsterdam at the beginning of 1934. They settled in an apartment on Merwedeplein Square in a calm, family-oriented neighborhood. Otto worked long hours. Edith tried to adapt, though she never felt comfortable away from her homeland. Margot started school. Anne, though she didn't know Dutch, integrated quickly. At 5 years old, she was bright, sociable, and full of energy. Otto managed to open a new branch of the company and sought to maintain stability. The girls attended school, made new friends, and played outdoors. Anne talked a lot, loved telling stories, and lived an ordinary childhood. Although far from their roots, they kept in touch with the grandparents who remained in Germany. The family believed that their new life in the Netherlands would protect them from anti-Semitism. Otto avoided drawing attention to himself. He worked diligently, fulfilled his responsibilities, and preferred to stay discreet. At home, they continued speaking German, but the girls learned the local language at school. Anne picked it up easily. Edith, on the other hand, never managed to feel part of the new environment. She didn't master the language, avoided going out, and spent most of her time at home. She only socialized with other Jewish women from the neighborhood. Even so, she tried to maintain a daily routine for her daughters. By the mid-1930s, several relatives also left Germany. The situation was visibly worsening. Synagogues were attacked, stores closed, and persecution was no longer hidden. Otto helped some relatives escape and offered them temporary shelter in his home. Anne grew up in this environment between 2 cultures. She spoke German at home but lived fully in a Dutch world. She attended school, played outdoors, and loved children's magazines. She was well liked by her friends and always enthusiastic. Margot, in contrast, was more studious and reserved. Otto believed he had made the right choice. His daughters were safe, his work was progressing, and life in Amsterdam seemed secure. At that time, he could not imagine that the regime he had fled would soon reach them there as well. Adaptation and routine in Amsterdam. Once settled in Amsterdam, the Franks tried to rebuild their daily life. Anne was 5 years old. She didn't know anyone and didn't yet speak the language, but she adapted easily. At school, she learned Dutch quickly. She was spontaneous and had many friends. Margot preferred to study and read at home. Otto Frank began working at Opekta, a company that sold products for making jam. He was diligent and precise and soon managed to stabilize the family's finances. In 1938, he founded a second company, Pectacon, focused on spices. As a precaution, he registered it under the names of non-Jewish employees, although he remained in full control. Edith, on the other hand, never fully integrated. The language was difficult for her. She had no social life beyond her family, and she rarely went out. She maintained contact with her mother in Germany and with her sister-in-law Elfriede, with whom she shared confidences. Despite her isolation, she made an effort to keep order in the home and raise her daughters in a calm environment. They lived in Merwedeplein, a residential square in the south of Amsterdam, lined with trees and benches where children played. Anne spent long afternoons running and inventing stories with her friends. In her room, she decorated the walls with clippings and photos, her way of feeling safe in this new world. The Franks respected Jewish holidays but were not strictly religious. They celebrated important dates with simplicity. Otto valued education and the learning of languages. The girls read a lot, even in other languages, and there was a small library at home. Although the Nazi regime was intensifying its violence in Germany, Amsterdam seemed untouched, a refuge for many Jewish families. Otto temporarily housed several relatives who fled. The situation was not ignored at home, but they tried not to live in constant fear. Margot attended Montessori school with excellent results. She was responsible and disciplined. Anne was outgoing and sometimes impulsive. Her teachers noted her liveliness. She loved inventing dialogues, writing, and performing imitations. Her grades were average, but she expressed herself fluently. On weekends, the family often went for walks, visited markets, parks, or friends. Otto worked hard, but always reserved Sundays for home. They spoke German, which created some distance from their neighbors, but it was part of their identity. Even though Anne and Margot spoke Dutch fluently, their mother tongue remained present at home. In 1937, Anne joined a group of neighborhood girls. They played outdoors, rode bikes, and shared secrets. They even founded a small club with code names. Ilse, Suzanne, Hannelie, and Jacqueline were her closest friends. In class, Anne talked non-stop, which got her remarks in her reports, though teachers were fond of her. Her parents tried to shield her and Margot from fear. They spoke discreetly about what was happening in Germany, new laws, attacks on shops, and deportations. Otto, foreseeing the worst, kept documents safe and thought about alternative plans. Still, he trusted the Netherlands' neutrality, as in the First World War. Anne and Margot attended Jewish catechism classes for a while, more out of tradition than belief. Life still seemed normal. They could go to the cinema, buy magazines, take public transport, and enjoy the city. The girls collected pictures of movie stars, did puzzles, and spent afternoons with friends. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. The following year, it invaded Czechoslovakia. Otto realized that the threat was spreading. He unsuccessfully applied for US visas and even considered emigrating to Cuba, but the process stalled. There were too many requests and too few approvals. Escape routes were almost impossible. By late 1939, Germany signed a pact with the Soviet Union and invaded Poland. The war officially began. The United Kingdom and France responded with a declaration. The Netherlands tried to remain neutral, but the danger was clear. Like many families, the Franks began to prepare. They stored money, preserved food, and made copies of important papers. Outwardly, little seemed to change, but inside Jewish homes, tension was rising. Otto relied on a network of loyal contacts and suppliers in case quick action was needed. Anne remained focused on her childhood, school, friends, and letter exchanges. Margot, more mature, understood better what was at stake. The adults spoke cautiously in front of them. They didn't want to frighten the girls. The occupation, the first laws of hate. On May 10, 1940, peace in the Netherlands came to an end. Early that morning, German troops crossed the border. In just 5 days, the Nazi army took complete control. The Queen fled to London and the country fell into the hands of the occupiers. What had seemed like a safe refuge for thousands of Jewish families became another territory under Hitler's rule. The Frank family, who had been living in Amsterdam for years, received the news with fear. Otto understood that the Nazis would waste no time in enforcing their rules. At first, the restrictions were subtle, but they soon became visible. Within months, Jews were excluded from public life. The first decrees prohibited Jews from holding positions in government, universities, or the media. Then they were expelled from public service and required to register officially. Signs excluding them began appearing on documents, in shops, buildings, and schools. At Anne's school, the changes came quickly. Jewish students and teachers were removed. Margot and Anne had to leave their regular schools and attend Jewish-only institutions. The new buildings were old, poorly equipped, and overcrowded. Still, the sisters tried to maintain their routines. Anne, though restless, continued to write, read, and imagine stories. Otto Frank tried to keep the Opekta company afloat. He knew he could no longer appear as the owner. He trusted his closest employees and made the necessary changes so the company would legally belong to non-Jewish partners, while he continued managing it behind the scenes. It was the only way to maintain an income without attracting attention. Out on the streets, change accelerated. German authorities began closing public places to Jews. They could no longer go to cinemas or restaurants or sit on certain benches. They were forbidden to use public transport, go out after certain hours, or visit parks and libraries. Every week, a new restriction appeared. The signs were clear. Shops displayed posters reading, "No Jews served." Propaganda spread through radios and newspapers. Families like the Franks could no longer live as before. The daughters went out less. Edith avoided speaking loudly. Distrust filled the air. In the spring of 1941, a census was ordered to identify all Jews in the country. They had to register their names, addresses, occupations, and family situations. Otto complied, but knew it was not a simple formality. It was part of a control system. Those who failed to register risked arrest. Police raids began. In some neighborhoods, men were dragged from their homes and taken to detention centers. No one knew where they were sent. Some managed to send letters from labor camps. Others vanished. Families began sleeping fully dressed with bags ready to flee in case of a night raid. In the Frank household, voices grew quiet. The girls started to sense that something very serious was happening. Anne kept writing in old notebooks, pasting clippings and chatting with friends. But her world was shrinking. Every week brought a new rule. They could no longer visit non-Jewish homes. Her old school friends drifted away. Otto received news from Germany, Austria, and Poland. He knew what was coming. That same year, he began preparing a hiding place. At the back of the building where his company operated, he identified a space that could be adapted. He told no one but a small group of trusted employees. In September 1941, Jewish children were banned from regular schools. Anne and Margot transferred to a Jewish secondary school. The building was far from home, and they could not use public transport. Edith walked or cycled with them when allowed. Anne wrote about her new classmates, some from other neighborhoods, all in the same situation. By the end of that year, the first deportations began. Groups of young men were summoned to local offices and then sent by train to Germany. The Nazi authorities claimed it was for labor, but letters that arrived home told another story: hunger, disease, and beatings. Those who returned were unrecognizable. Others never came back. Officials began openly talking about resettlement. Lists were drawn up. Families feared being summoned. The notices arrived by mail or by phone. No one knew when their turn would come. The Franks reinforced their plan. Otto sped up work on the hiding place, checking access, supplies, and layout, all in silence. Meanwhile, the streets filled with soldiers, collaborationist police, and civilian informers. Raids became common. At any hour, trucks stopped outside buildings and families were dragged away. Neighbors watched from windows. Some warned others. Some stayed silent. Many pretended not to know. At home, Edith cooked only what was necessary, saving everything possible. Otto gathered documents, maps, and supplies. Anne watched as cupboards filled with jars, cans, and suitcases. Sometimes she asked questions, but no one gave clear answers. She was 13 years old. She knew there was danger, but couldn't grasp its full meaning. On April 29, 1942, a new decree changed everything. All Jews over the age of 6 had to wear a yellow star sewn onto their clothing. The order came with threats. Anyone not wearing it could be arrested. The star was visible, mandatory, impossible to hide. It was the symbol that marked their separation from the rest. Anne and Margot stepped out into the street wearing their new insignia. It was the final stage before going into hiding. Summoned to disappear, the final warning. Before the hiding on June 12, 1942, Anne turned 13. It was a quiet morning at the Frank household. Her parents tried to bring a touch of joy to the day despite the hostile atmosphere in the city. Among her gifts, she received a hard-covered notebook with red and white checks. She had chosen it herself a few days earlier at a nearby stationery shop. That notebook would become, from that day on, the space where she would begin to write. From then on, Anne filled its pages with frequent entries. She did not know that this diary would become one of the most important testimonies of the Jewish persecution. To her, it was simply a way to let her thoughts out. She wrote about her daily life and emotions. Without saying it directly, she understood that danger was closing in around her. The diary was not a secret. Her parents knew she had it, but they did not read it. Anne wrote freely, inventing names, describing her home, her school, and the situation in her country, through the eyes of a teenager trying to understand a world growing ever more hostile. During those weeks, restrictions worsened. At school, rumors spread constantly, arrests, trains filled with people who never returned. It was said they were sent away to do hard labor. No one knew for sure, only fear remained. Everyone knew the worst thing was to appear on those lists. The family still lived in their Mervedeplein apartment. Outwardly, life seemed normal. The girls went to school, Otto kept working, and Edith only went out when necessary. But inside, tension was constant. Otto received warnings from acquaintances. Raids were becoming more frequent. In some neighborhoods, entire families were taken, regardless of age. Meanwhile, the hiding place was nearly finished. Otto had been planning it for some time. Together with a few trusted employees, he had prepared a hidden section behind the company building. It was concealed by a movable bookcase. Behind it lay an annex with small rooms, a simple kitchen, and covered windows. Only a handful of people knew about the plan: Miep Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, Bep Voskiel, and her father Johannes. Each had a task: bringing food, news, useful items, and maintaining appearances. If anyone discovered them, everyone would be at risk. On July 5, 1942, everything changed. 16-year-old Margot received an official summons. She had to report for deportation to a labor camp. There were no explanations, only a date and place. Failure to comply meant severe punishment. Otto decided not to wait any longer. That night he told Edith it was time to hide. On the morning of July 6th, they would leave without saying goodbye to anyone. Anne was told that same night. She was asked to pack only the essentials, nothing large, nothing noticeable. Before bed, Anne placed her diary in her backpack. She added books, pencils, and a few photographs. Margot did the same. Edith wrapped clothes in blankets. Otto hid documents and valuables in the office. At dawn, they left one by one, taking secondary streets. They wore several layers of clothing to disguise their luggage. They walked to the company building, entered through a side door, crossed the hallway, moved the bookcase, and slipped into the annex. They closed everything in silence. The confinement had begun. During the first days, only the four of them were there: Anne, Margot, Edith, and Otto. They divided the space, slept on old mattresses, and kept the curtains drawn. From 8 in the morning until late afternoon, they couldn't make a sound. Only after 6, when the employees left, could they move more freely. Anne kept writing from the first day. She described what it was like to live without going out, how they organized themselves, and what she felt. She knew that if they were discovered, they would be arrested. She couldn't imagine what would come next, but understood this was no simple hiding place. On July 13th, a week later, 3 more people arrived: Herman van Pels, his wife Auguste, and their 16-year-old son, Peter. Otto had known them before. The already cramped space became tighter. Anne and Margot shared a small room. The Van Pels' presence changed everything. They had to take turns for everything: the bathroom, the kitchen, even silence. Food had to be rationed. Arguments began. Anne did not get along with Auguste, finding her manner irritating. She barely spoke to Peter, something that would later change. On August 21st, another person joined them, Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist and acquaintance, quiet and serious. Now there were 8 of them. Anne had to share her room with him. It was not easy. Their routines clashed and they had little in common. Anne wrote candidly about how uncomfortable the coexistence was. They could no longer go out or open the windows. The air hardly circulated. Only the helpers went upstairs, bringing food, news and supplies. Every move had to be made with extreme caution. Even neighbors posed a risk. The final months of 1942 passed between confinement, routine and tension. No one knew how long it would last. Anne documented everything: the group's mood, small changes, and daily friction. Writing was her only form of release. Her diary became an essential part of their daily survival. Imprisoned for being Jewish, 2 years of silent fear. From July 6, 1942, the 8 inhabitants of the annex lived each day confined within closed walls. Anne, Margot, their parents, the Van Pels family, and Mr. Pfeffer shared every corner. The hiding place had several small areas: bedrooms, a common room, a bathroom, an attic with a stove, and an improvised kitchen. The walls were covered with shelves and cloths to block out the light. There were strict rules. Between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, silence was mandatory. No noise, no footsteps in shoes, no sudden movements. Workers continued downstairs. No one could suspect anything. Only a few employees knew what was really happening above. Everything ran on schedules: turns for the bathroom, for cooking, for washing. They ate whatever the helpers could find. Sometimes there was stale bread, potatoes, or a bit of margarine. Other times only a thin soup. Every portion was measured. Nothing was wasted. Anne wrote every day. She recorded what they ate, how they organized themselves, and the tensions that arose. Coexistence was not easy. Some days were calm. On others, a single word could spark arguments. The lack of space and constant fear wore everyone down. Van Pels smoked secretly. Edith spoke little. Margot withdrew into her reading. The days repeated endlessly. Mornings were spent in silence. Reading, sewing, studying, writing. Peter repaired things. Pfeffer practiced French. Otto coordinated chores. Edith cooked. Anne wrote. Days blurred together. Only news from the outside marked time. At 12:30, when employees went down to lunch, they could whisper, move carefully, and open the curtains for a few minutes. Sometimes they listened to the BBC on a hidden radio, their only link to the world. Anne noted every report: advances, bombings, hopes of liberation. Winters were harsh. There was no heat. They slept clothed under thin blankets. Water froze in containers. Anne wrote wearing gloves. In summer, the air hardly moved. The heat was suffocating. The walls dripped with moisture. Anne and Peter began to grow closer. At first, they spoke briefly, then shared confidences. Sometimes they went up to the attic together. Anne began to feel something for him. She wrote about holding hands, hugging, and later kissing. Her mother disapproved. Otto stayed neutral. Peter was reserved. Anne was impulsive. With Pfeffer, her roommate, tensions were constant. She couldn't stand his energy, laughter, or interruptions. She described him as strict and humorless. Otto, by contrast, was her steady, understanding anchor, her guide through confinement. The helpers did their best to sustain them. Food was increasingly scarce. Coupons were insufficient. Some stores were watched, others' owners arrested. Miep and Bepp risked their lives every time they came upstairs. Victor Kugler invented excuses to justify movements within the company. Outside, news was terrifying: deportations, trains with no return, camps in the east. Otto filtered the information to spare the girls, but everyone knew the rumors were true. Letters stopped arriving. Families vanished without warning. Despite it all, Anne never stopped writing. Her pages spoke of confinement, her thoughts, her growth. She invented an imaginary friend, Kitty, to whom she wrote letters filled with doubt, fear, and hope. She felt that even in captivity she was still maturing. Birthdays were simple: a piece of bread with something sweet, a candle lit for a few seconds. Anne turned 14 and then 15 inside the annex. Over 500 days without going outside, always seeing the same faces, without natural light or contact with the world. In spring 1944, Anne heard on the radio that the Dutch government in exile urged people to keep diaries and testimonies to rebuild what had happened. She decided to revise her writings, rereading, correcting, and organizing them. Her diary was no longer just a refuge, it was becoming a testimony. Tension grew constantly, arguments increased, food was scarce, news was unclear. Some said the Allies were advancing, others that Nazi repression was worsening. Anne recorded everything. She still believed she would one day be free, study, and become a writer. She had already filled several notebooks, kept in a folder carefully hidden. Miep knew where it was and promised to try to save them if anything happened. Anne noticed her own transformation. She was no longer a child. She saw the others more clearly: Edith's sadness, August's despair, Otto's exhaustion, Peter's fragility. Every noise in the building could mean the end. They heard footsteps, bangs, doors, sometimes false alarms, sometimes real danger. One night a thief broke a window. Another time someone tried to force a door. Each incident left them on edge. For more than 2 years the 8 lived in hiding. Without air, without streets, without contact, only 5 people helped them. Only hope kept them alive. Anne wrote until August 1st, 1944. 3 days later they were discovered. Saving without being seen, the risks of helping the Franks. While the 8 occupants of the annex struggled to survive in silence, they depended entirely on a small group of people who risked everything to help them. Without that external support, life in hiding would not have lasted even a week. Those who protected them did not do it out of obligation or for profit. They did it because they believed it was the right thing to do, even knowing that if discovered, they could be arrested or worse. Miep Gies was the main link between the outside world and those in hiding. She had worked for Otto Frank's company before the occupation and was one of the few people he fully trusted. Every day she brought food, books, news, and whatever else was needed. Sometimes she carried fruit, second-hand clothes, or medicine. She moved cautiously, never drawing attention, skilled at deflecting questions and avoiding suspicion. Bep Voskiel was also part of the group, young, single, and familiar with the office routines. She helped with administrative work, but also climbed to the annex whenever possible. She had a close bond with Anne, bringing her writing paper, library novels, and sometimes cosmetics, small gestures that kept a sense of normality. Her father, Johannes Voskiel, also helped. He built the revolving bookcase that hid the entrance to the annex and often repaired things inside without anyone noticing. Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were the legal heads of the company since Otto could no longer appear as manager. Both knew the secret. They maintained the business front, managed accounts, received visitors, and acted as if everything was normal, while hiding documents, diverting inspections, and muffling sounds. They never said a word too many. The 5 formed a silent network, always alert. Each had a role and a margin of action. They communicated through signals, a knock on the wall, a code word, a warning phrase. If unexpected visitors arrived, they pretended not to have access to the back area. If patrols were in the street, they avoided all movement. Getting food was a daily task. They couldn't buy large quantities in one place. Miep visited several markets, stores, and bakeries, asking for small portions to avoid suspicion. She hid what she could in her bag or bicycle baskets. Sometimes Bep helped with ration coupons, borrowed or forged. The risk was constant. The streets were monitored and random inspections occurred often. The helpers also kept the group informed. They read newspapers, listened to the radio, and shared essential updates. Sometimes they softened the news to avoid distress, but when something affected their safety directly, they spoke plainly, warning of nearby raids, arrests of suppliers, or new decrees. Miep and her husband Jan were the only ones who knew the exact address of the annex outside work hours. Jan never went up but helped from outside. He provided extra coupons, sought information on deportations, and handled deliveries. He was part of the resistance, though he told no one. The less others knew, the safer they all were. During the 2 years in hiding, the helpers also faced personal struggles. Johannes Voskiel fell ill with cancer. Despite the pain, he helped as long as he could. Bep tried not to show her worry, though it deeply affected her. Miep also had moments of despair, days when she couldn't find enough food and returned empty-handed, feeling responsible for keeping them alive. The relationship between the hidden and their protectors was complex. Though there was gratitude, tensions sometimes arose. Anne or Auguste would complain about the quality of the food, or requests were made for things difficult to find. Miep and Bep understood that confinement strained tempers, but it hurt when their effort wasn't appreciated. Still, the helpers never failed. They never talked, never accepted money, and never showed fatigue. Every day they climbed the stairs with fear, aware that neighbors could see them, that a new employee might suspect something, that a routine inspection could doom them all. The hidden ones could do nothing without them, from food to toilet paper, books, soap, towels, or pencils. Everything depended on what the helpers could find. If one of them fell ill, it was felt immediately. If they missed a day, the void was obvious. When they arrived, they were greeted with relief. They brought a breath of life into a place defined by waiting. Miep tried to bring topics for conversation: the weather, the streets, simple things. She also brought news, friends, acquaintances, or the state of the war. Sometimes they were hopeful: Allied advances in Africa or BBC talks of an invasion in France. Other times the news was grim: arrests, deportations, new Nazi decrees. In 1943, Bep managed to find schoolbooks for Margot and worksheets for Anne. Both continued studying. Otto organized daily lessons. They used old books, copied exercises, and read quietly. Edith improvised lessons. It was a way to keep their minds active. Without those materials, the days would have been emptier. The helpers also protected the legal facade. If anyone asked about Otto, they said he had left the country. If letters or bills arrived, they answered them. They kept up appearances, forging signatures, moving documents, and answering the phone confidently. No one could suspect anything. By late 1943, the situation became more dangerous. The resistance intensified its actions and Nazi reprisals grew harsher: more inspections, more patrols. Miep and Jan had to hide some papers at home. Bep reduced her visits. Victor and Kleiman were questioned several times about company matters. Although none confessed, the danger was undeniable. Still, none of them gave up. They kept helping, each in their own way. By July 1944, as rumors spread that the Nazi regime was weakening, Anne wrote that she felt everything might soon change. But on August 4th, everything stopped. The day they were found, Anne Frank captured by the Gestapo. On August 4th, 1944, the silence of the annex ended. That morning, around 10 a.m., a vehicle stopped in front of Prinsengracht 263. From it stepped German police officers led by Karl Josef Silberbauer, an SS officer in civilian clothes, accompanied by several Dutch policemen. There was no warning, no time to hide anything. The occupants of the hiding place were taken completely by surprise. They couldn't close doors or conceal belongings. Silberbauer and his men entered through the main office, guided by an anonymous tip. Inside, everything seemed normal, but one officer went straight to the revolving bookcase. He moved it. Behind it was the entrance to the annex. They had found it. They entered without hesitation. They shouted, aimed their weapons, and ordered everyone to come out with their hands up. Otto, Edith, Margot, and Anne were in the common room. Peter tried to hide, but was caught. Hermann, Auguste, and Mr. Pfeffer were also dragged out. No one resisted. They knew there was no way out. The officers searched for money, jewelry, and documents. They rummaged through drawers, threw papers on the floor, and opened trunks. They took whatever little they could find of value. They didn't care about notebooks, loose pages, or personal items. Those were left behind, scattered across the annex floor. Among the papers lay Anne's diary, in its usual place with other notebooks. Miep Gies, who had witnessed the raid from below, went upstairs hours later. She carefully collected everything she found. She knew those papers were important. She didn't know if Anne would ever return, but she kept them safe. The 8 occupants were first taken to the local Gestapo headquarters, where they spent hours locked up, unaware of their fate. They were interrogated separately. They didn't know who had betrayed them. No one told them anything. No formal charges, just quick questions, shoves, and orders. Later, they were transferred to the Amstelveense detention center. That same day, 2 of their helpers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, were also arrested and taken to different detention centers. Miep and Bep, however, were not arrested. Despite being present, Miep was allowed to leave. She would later say that one of the officers was Austrian, like her. Perhaps that was why he let her go, though barely. He released her with a warning. At the detention center, the Franks and the others waited 2 days. They didn't know where they would be taken. They ate stale bread and drank dirty water. They slept sitting up, under constant light. There were other prisoners. People spoke of trains, of camps, of transports to the east. New words for Anne. No one explained anything, only orders. On August 8th, they were loaded onto a truck and taken to the Westerbork transit camp. where all arrested Jews in the Netherlands were sent. It was the final stop before deportation eastward. It wasn't an extermination camp, but there were fences, armed guards, and wooden barracks. At Westerbork, the 8 were classified as prisoners for the crime of hiding, which meant extra punishment. They were placed in the punishment barrack, a dark, cold, noisy space with no beds, only straw on the floor. They shared it with dozens of others, surrounded by crying, shouting, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Work at Westerbork was forced. Men dismantled used batteries, women cleaned metal parts or sorted items. It was dangerous work, and the pieces were contaminated, the air toxic. There were no masks, no protection. Anne and Margot worked barehanded, separating components. Edith, weaker, could hardly keep up. Despite the imprisonment, the group from the annex stayed together. They slept in the same barrack, spoke in whispers, and shared what little they had. Otto tried to keep them united. August wept silently. Hermann said nothing. Pfeffer argued about everything. Peter hardly ate. Anne watched. She no longer wrote. She had no notebooks. Every Tuesday, a train departed eastward. Prisoners waited for the weekly list with dread. No one knew who would be called. The names were read over loudspeakers. Each selected group had to gather their belongings and board freight wagons. The destination was never announced. On September 3, 1944, the Frank family's names appeared on the list, along with the Van Pels and Pfeffer. That day, the last transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz departed with over 1,000 people. Among them were Anne, her family, and the others from the annex. The journey lasted 3 days. They traveled packed together, standing or sitting on the floor. There were no toilets, only a bucket. The wagon had no windows, just a small slit near the top. They ate what little they had brought. Most didn't know where they were going. Some suspected. Others still believed in the labor camps. Otto Frank, 65 years old, tried to stay strong. Edith cared for Margot. Anne whispered with Peter. August was in shock. Hermann was unresponsive. Pfeffer had a fever. The air inside was suffocating. Some didn't survive the trip. The rest arrived exhausted. Behind the train doors, the road to Auschwitz. On September 6, 1944, the train carrying Anne Frank, her family, the Van Pels, and Fritz Pfeffer arrived at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. The journey from Westerbork had lasted 3 days in sealed freight cars, cramped without enough food and with no information. When the doors finally opened, it was night. The shouts of German soldiers, barking dogs, and blinding spotlights marked their arrival. The prisoners stepped out one by one, dazed and confused. On the platform, guards in dark uniforms divided men from women. Otto was separated from Edith, Margot, and Anne at that moment. There were no embraces, no farewells, only quick, shouted orders. No one knew if they would ever see each other again. The men were sent to an inspection area. Otto was classified as fit for labor, others were not so lucky. Meanwhile, the women were lined up. A Nazi doctor walked past them, deciding with a flick of his hand who would go to the barracks and who to the gas chambers. Anne, Margot, and Edith passed the selection, as did August Van Pels. Many others did not. The group was led along a long path lined with fences and guard towers. They reached an area where they were ordered to strip completely. Their hair was shaved, all belongings taken, and they were given old rags, often clothing from prisoners who had already died. Most had no shoes, only wooden clogs that didn't fit. No explanations were given, only screams and commands. After processing, they were taken to a women's block. Conditions were minimal: worn-out mattresses, constant dampness, closed windows. They slept crammed together, 3 to a bunk. The blankets were infested with lice. The stench was unbearable. Lights went out at 8 and speaking was forbidden. Every day there were roll calls in the yard, sometimes lasting hours. Anyone who moved was beaten. Those who collapsed were left on the ground. Days repeated endlessly. At 5 in the morning, a siren marked the start. Everyone lined up for roll call, then they were divided into labor groups. Edith, Anne, and Margot spent hours carrying stones, pushing carts, or doing meaningless tasks. Sometimes they were forced to stand still for hours under the sun or in the freezing cold. Meals consisted of a grey liquid served in rusty cans. At noon, a piece of stale bread. At night, a watery soup. Anne mentally recorded what she experienced, though she no longer had her diary. Her strength faded with each passing week. Margot, quieter, endured the punishment with resignation. Edith tried to remain calm, helping her daughters when she could, even as her own health declined. The barracks echoed with coughing, crying, and whispers. Prisoners came from everywhere: French, Czech, Polish, Hungarian. Many didn't share a language but shared the same hunger, fear, and filth. Water was scarce, showers barely worked. Disease spread quickly. There was no medicine. Those who fell ill had to hide it. If guards noticed, they were taken away and never returned. Anne stayed close to her mother and sister. They shared food and tried to help each other survive. Otto was in another section with the men. They weren't allowed to communicate. For weeks, they didn't know if he was alive. He, in turn, thought of his daughters every day, knowing he couldn't reach them. Cold came in October. Nights were unbearable. Feet froze. The thin blankets offered no warmth. The ground turned to mud. Rats ran between the bunks. Prisoners covered themselves with whatever they could find. Edith used an old coat to cover Margot. Anne coughed constantly. Her voice grew weaker each day. Inspections were frequent. If a bunk was dirty or a prisoner moved without permission, she was beaten. Sometimes women disappeared at night. No one asked questions. Everyone knew what it meant. In November, Edith could no longer work. Her body gave out. She was taken to the infirmary, a place from which few ever returned. She died quietly. Anne and Margot never got to say goodbye. They only learned later that their mother was gone. The routine continued. Roll calls, labor, hunger. Anne spoke less. Margot stayed silent. They leaned on each other just to stay upright. Time lost meaning. They didn't know what day it was or how long they had been there. They only hoped to survive one more day. At the end of October 1944, another selection took place. Officers went through the barracks, reading names and ordering women to prepare. Anne and Margot were on the list. Along with hundreds of others, they were loaded onto another train. No one knew where they were going. Some thought it was the end. Others believed it was just another transfer. They said nothing. They obeyed. That train took them to Bergen-Belsen, a camp in northern Germany. They left Auschwitz without knowing they would never see their father again. Otto remained there until he was liberated by Soviet troops months later. Anne and Margot faced a new place, with new rules, new dangers, and without their mother. Dying of typhus and hunger in a camp with no escape. The final winter. After being transferred from Auschwitz, Anne and Margot arrived at Bergen-Belsen at the end of October 1944. From the first day, everything was different. There was no selection, no inspection on arrival. They were taken straight to a set of windowless barracks where hundreds of prisoners were already piled together. The camp was chaotic. No one explained the rules or gave information. Anne and Margot were placed in one of the worst areas. No free bunks, no blankets, no running water. The showers didn't work. Waste buckets overflowed constantly. The floor was covered in mud, excrement, and old clothes. New arrivals received a single piece of bread when they entered. That was their meal for the day. Winter came immediately. Within days, the temperature dropped and the damp cold became permanent. The sisters settled in a corner of the barrack. There was no room to lie down. They slept half-seated, feet frozen, clothes soaked. The camp was overcrowded. Women from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, France. Each spoke a different language, but all shared the same misery. Anne listened to conversations she didn't understand. No one spoke of the future, only hunger and the next roll call. By mid-November, Margot began to shiver and complain of pain in her legs. She didn't say much. She forced herself to walk and reached the food station when she could. Anne supported her whenever necessary. Though weak, she avoided asking for help. In December, the situation worsened. More transports arrived, but there was no space. New prisoners slept outside or in hallways. The number of deaths rose daily. Barrack leaders could no longer cope. Bodies were not buried. They were stacked behind the building. Drinking water ran out. Prisoners drank melted snow or dirty puddle water. There was no soap, no dry clothing. The same wet coat served to sleep, to stand roll call, and to cover a sick sister. Cracked hands bled. Swollen feet no longer fit in shoes. By early January 1945, no one remembered the date. The sun rose and fell without meaning. The sirens still marked morning, but many could no longer stand. Those who missed roll call were beaten. Those who couldn't move were dragged away. By mid-January, Margot could no longer walk. Anne begged for help to carry her. Some days she managed, others not. A Polish inmate gave them a dry rag and a piece of bread. Anne didn't eat it. She gave it all to Margot. By the end of the month, Anne developed a fever. At first, she thought it was from the cold, then came headaches, nausea, and weakness. She spoke little, answered with gestures, and struggled to sit up. She wrapped herself in the same blanket that covered Margot. Guards checked the barracks at night. If someone was motionless too long, they were taken away. The sisters pretended to sleep. Once a sick woman was mistaken for dead and dragged out. Anne stayed still, breathing quietly. She didn't want to be noticed. In February, a Red Cross team inspected part of the camp but never reached their section. They never knew it came, nor did they know that elsewhere rations had slightly improved. In their barrack, nothing changed. One night, Margot moved suddenly and fell from her bunk. She didn't get up. Anne reached for her. She was cold. She didn't call for help. She sat beside her in silence. Those nearby understood. No one spoke. At dawn, the body was still there. The guards didn't remove it. Anne didn't react. She didn't cry. She stayed still for hours. That evening, she lay on her side and never got up again. Fellow prisoners said they never saw her stand afterward. Her face was pale, eyes half open, whispering incoherently. 2 days later, Anne died. No one knew the exact day. No one could bury her. Her body was wrapped in an old sack and taken away with others. The mass graves were full, corpses decayed in the open air. On April 15, 1945, the British Army reached Bergen-Belsen. They found over 10,000 unburied bodies. They found prisoners unable to stand. They found rats, filth, lice, and contaminated water. The conditions were so appalling that even soldiers were shocked. None of them knew the names of the Frank sisters. There were no records, no identifications. Only months later, through testimonies of survivors, the truth emerged. One of them, Jannie Brillersleiper, had been in the same barrack. She recalled how Margot died first and Anne followed, motionless and fading away. Otto Frank, back in Amsterdam, searched for answers. He had been liberated from Auschwitz in January. Upon returning to the Netherlands, he wrote letters, checked lists, and visited the Red Cross. For weeks, there was silence. Then came confirmation. Edith had died. Later, a woman told him she had shared a barrack with Anne and Margot, that both had died of typhus and starvation together until the end. Otto recovered nothing. He had nowhere to go. Only his daughter's notebook remained. Anne Frank did not die alone. She died among thousands whose only crime was being born into the wrong family in the wrong country under a regime that did not want them alive. Her story was not unique, but it was one of the few that left a trace. It was not her voice that survived, it was her words. From her arrest to her death in Bergen-Belsen, only 7 months passed. In that short time, she witnessed human decay in all its forms: isolation, hunger, disease, cold, loss. She had no trial, no lawyer, no right to say goodbye. She was transported, classified, stripped, imprisoned, and forgotten. The names of those directly responsible for her death appear in no record. There was no punishment for those who shut the door of that wagon, nor for those who ignored her illness. Only the indirect testimony of other women remains, those who by chance survived to tell it. Her father, Otto, was the only survivor from the group who lived in the secret annex. When he learned the truth, there was nothing left for him to do but hold the notebook his daughter had written. Those simple pages, written without pretense, captured 2 years of hidden life. They showed what a teenage girl thought while the world collapsed around her. Today, that diary is read by millions, not as literature or a symbol, but as proof. Proof of what happened, proof of what was done, proof of how far silence can go when no one dares to see. And you? How would you have survived that nightmare?